is Erin Fleckenstein, and I'm with the North Carolina Coastal Federation out of the Manteo Field Office. And I was charged today with telling you about some examples here from the Pamlico and Albemarle Sound of living shoreline projects that we as an organization have been engaged with. We are a nonprofit environmental organization working in all 20 coastal counties of North Carolina. We focus on clean water in the coast through our advocacy, education, and restoration programming. I would encourage all of you to become members of our organization if you're not already. And we work a lot on living shorelines. So you're going to hear and see yet another definition of living shorelines. But this is going to sort of rehash a lot of what Carolyn and Steve and Kevin were talking about. So living shorelines are a creative approach to maintaining, restoring, or enhancing the shoreline's natural habitats, while also stabilizing the estuarine shoreline, minimizing erosion, maintaining or enhancing water quality, maintaining the sediment budget, maintaining our public trust lands, and maintaining that intertidal zone. So all of those important ecosystem services that Carolyn was talking about in her opening presentation are the main reasons why we're trying to keep living shorelines and promote living shorelines. And of course, the design considerations that we have to keep in mind is the fetch. It's critical here, but also the bathymetry. So Carolyn was showing how some of these projects are really only doing well 5 miles with 5 miles of fetch. But if you have shallow water for half a mile, which we can have here in Pamlico Sound, the fetch might be able to be extended a little bit longer. So having both the fetch and bathymetry, storm frequency and intensity, the existing vegetation, shoreline type, so whether you have those steep bluffs, you have a forested shoreline or a marsh shoreline, the soil type is a consideration, and the land use. So there's been a series of compilations done. These are some documents that were put together by the Division of Coastal Management in the 2000s, looking at how the state is putting forth recommendations for living shorelines and estuarine shoreline stabilization measures. There's one that compiles the scientific evidence, the biological and physical processes work, as well as a guide for property owners to help determine what the best stabilization measure is for their shoreline. And the results of those documents put together a hierarchy of erosion control options. The first one being no action. If you have an erosion occurring, you can take no action. That is an option. You can relocate threatened structures. You can use non-structural stabilization measures such as slope grading and marsh planting and bioengineering. You can use combination structures such as sills, stone containment cells, breakwaters with plantings, or you can use more hardened structures such as the groins, revetments, and bulkheads. My conversation is going to focus on these top 4 types of shoreline stabilization measures, and we'll go through a couple examples of those. I do also want to point out this was a document that was just issued this fall. It is difficult to see here, but it's a NOAA publication. It's called Guidance for Considering the Use of Living Shorelines. And it also puts together a nice hierarchy of living shoreline and shoreline stabilization options. And it follows those very same hierarchy options that I just went through the Division of Coastal Management with more of a spectrum here with living shorelines, vegetation plantings only sort of towards the left here, and more hardened structures toward the right. Again, my conversation or my presentation is going to focus on these 4 major shoreline stabilization measures. So no action and relocation of threatened structures. Many of you guys might recognize this structure. Anyone know this house? The Knights and Rodanthe house, exactly. So I would say this is a threatened structure. It's on our ocean front. They did have the option of taking no action for this building, right? They could have left it. You can also, before you even have a structure in place, land use planning is very critical. Knowing what your erosion rates are before you even build and taking those into consideration is always a great measure so you don't have to get to this point. Of course, because of the significance of this house, it was actually relocated. So it was put onto a flatbed truck and driven down the road about a mile, and it's now located a little bit further inland, but still in place. Some non-structural stabilization measures. So if you are not willing to relocate or take no action, you can do some relatively non-invasive stabilization measures such as marsh grass plantings and regradings. So this is a site in Currituck Sound. This is the Army Corps of Engineers Duck Research Station right behind their facility. And you can see that the shoreline was experiencing some erosion. There was some concern about impacts to the roadbed as well as the infrastructure that was in place. And they decided, since they were the research station, that they were going to experiment with shoreline stabilization. And they went out and just repeatedly planted marsh grasses for over a number of years. And eventually the marsh grasses took hold on some of those sand flats and then started to fill in and create more of a contiguous marsh. So this was with no grading, no fill was brought in, just repeated marsh grass plantings over a period of time. Now they were willing to wait for that stabilization to occur, and like I said, they were also willing to experiment and try something out before going towards more of a hardened structure. If the slopes and elevation are not adequate for just marsh plantings alone, you can consider regrading or bringing in some sediment and fill. But there is a concern with bringing in fill and the possible introduction of invasive species. So really trying to work with the native sediment as much as possible is definitely always best. Biologs, this was a question raised in an earlier presentation. Biologs are an option for shoreline stabilization. They tend to work better in the quieter, shallower waters where we don't have a lot of fetch or of wave action, but they can be installed. And here's a typical diagram where you actually have a small piece of rock that is stabilizing the toe of the biolog. The biolog is installed basically at the toe of the marsh to help hold the shoreline in place. This is an example of a biolog installation that was done in the Chesapeake. It's actually got a tiered approach. It's difficult to see, but there is a layer of biologs that was installed at the base of this bluff, and then another layer of biologs that were installed a little bit higher up. And this is actually our coastal scientist from Wilmington. Her name's Tracy Scrable. This is her brother-in-law's property. So he wanted to use the most environmentally sensitive method possible, and this has been quite successful in stabilizing his shoreline. Combination approaches, so moving towards more engineered, or not necessarily engineered, but a little bit away from just those non-structural approaches. But this is an example of a wooden sill that was installed, and I really like this picture because it contrasts the difference between what's a wooden sill and what's a bulkhead. So you can see the bulkhead is placed right here at that upland interface, whereas the sill is placed just offshore, about 15, 20 feet offshore, and it is much lower profile than the bulkhead, so the waves are actually able to break over top, and you have the slope grading and marsh grass plantings that help to create that living habitat, that marsh interface. This is an example of a wooden sill that was installed at it's called Camp Leach, and it was in place for a number of years, about 9 years actually. And then when the land changed ownership, the landowners decided to remove this wooden sill, and within 9 months, they were starting to bulkhead and protect their shoreline with more structural approaches because they didn't realize how much protection they were gaining from that sill and those marsh grass plantings. So another kind of combination approach, if the conditions are right for oyster growth, you can use a oyster bag sill. This is an example of a project we did at Jockey's Ridge State Park. There was some erosion that was occurring along the shoreline, both from historic development pressure as well as just the shifting sands of the dune. We're starting to suffocate the marsh on the back, the fringing marsh on the backside of Jockey's Ridge. So we did a series of stabilization measures, including installing sand fencing on the upper edge of the desired marsh area in order to slow down that sand movement into this zone. And then we put an offshore oyster bag sill that I'll show you some more pictures of to stabilize the marsh area. This is the one of many giant mounds of oyster shell that we used to create the stone sill. We used about 5,000 bushels of shell in order to create this sill. And we had a team of volunteers. These 8th graders did not know what they were signing up for, but they worked very hard to bag the oyster shell for us. We do as an organization use volunteers for much of our work, and getting the students involved in our projects is one of our key strategies. So I think they had fun. We brought them oyster shell. They got to get out of class and go bag shell and spend a day outside. And then we brought a group of college students and other volunteers to help build the sill. And once it was done, this is what it looked like. It was protecting a little bit of fringing marsh that was well established, as well as the area that had scoured out and eroded away. And then through a series of marsh grass plantings, over time, this is right after the marsh was originally planted, it started to mature and the roots spread, and this is what it looked like last summer. So over time, those marsh grasses spread, and I do have to thank Ellen Kolodny, who you're going to hear from more. She helped us with our plant selection for this site. So we had one zone that was not establishing with marsh grasses, and she said, "Have you tried 3 square?" I said, "No, we haven't," and it took off. So thank you, Ellen. You did see earlier from Carolyn's presentation, instead of having bagged shell, you can use loose shell in certain locations and pile it up, mound it into an offshore reef structure. You can also use these things called oyster domes or reef blocks. So oyster shell is a very rare commodity, if you will. It's very difficult to come by, and so we try not to use oyster shell if we know it's not going to work for growing oysters. And we also have found some different ways, some different structures and methods for building these oyster sills that use actually loose marl or bagged marl as the base of these structures, and then just cap them with the oyster bags, so that you're actually just creating a veneer, because that's where we're seeing oyster growth occurring, is on the top of these sills and the fronts of these sills. So as much as possible, trying to minimize the amount of oyster shell that you use is sort of a lesson that we've learned along the way. And these oyster domes do work very nicely at recruiting oysters, and they can be manufactured. If you have a mold, you can make them yourself and install them. They come in all different sizes, and they're quite interesting. I have not personally worked with them, but they are successful down in the Carteret area and Wilmington area. This is an example of a combination approach with a granite sill. This is a Wildlife Resource Commission boat ramp in Edenton that had a bulkhead in place, and the bulkhead was in need of repair and replacement. So we started conversations with the Wildlife Resource Commission to actually replace this with a granite sill. And so the bulkhead was removed, rock was placed just offshore, the shoreline was regraded, marsh grasses were planted, and then again over a series of subsequent plantings, and of course Ellen Kolodny's wonderful plant expertise, we have a beautifully well-established sill at the Wildlife Resource Commission boat ramp. With a lot of diverse freshwater wetland plant species. This is an example of a project here at Lassiter Landing. We're going to see this later today in the field, but I wanted you to see sort of what the site looked like as it was going to construction. This is, the adjacent property owner had a rock revetment in place. And so again, this is a nice contrasting picture between what a rock revetment looks like, where it's right up against the uplands, as opposed to a low-profile sill that's placed offshore, and it's much shorter in stature than the revetment would be. And so you'll get to see what the after looks like in person, so I didn't want to ruin the surprise. This is kind of like your teaser. Another example of a granite sill that we worked on is down at Durant's Point in Hatteras Harbor. This is an aerial shot of Hatteras. And they had an existing rock jetty and revetment here that the Army Corps of Engineers had put in place in order to protect the entrance to Hatteras Harbor. But this stretch of land here is called Durant's Point, and it's a privately owned strip of land, but it's uninhabited. And the concern that we were seeing is that there's about 2 to 5 feet of erosion occurring each year on this strip of land. And the concern was that eventually it would break through and threaten Hatteras Harbor. So we worked with local fishermen and the private landowners in order to cost share on a living shoreline for their property. This is what it looked like in 2009 when we started going. You can see that some of the cedars were starting to fall into the marsh. We were starting to see some scour. We really only had the upland marsh species, Spartina patens, that was still around. So we built an offshore sill. It was designed by Sill Engineering, regraded the shoreline, and then over a course of several years with marsh grass plantings, the marsh has nicely established at Durant's Point. I will say that we approached the adjacent landowners this is a 300-foot sill, and we did approach the adjacent landowners and asked if they wanted to participate, and they said no, they did not want to participate. But they now have very severe erosion on their stretch of shoreline. It may be due to some of the scouring coming from our sill, but it's actually all along this stretch. That stretch of shoreline has just continued to march back in a way that the stretch that we've protected with this living shoreline has not. What to do when you inherit a shoreline? This is a project down on Ocracoke. This is Springer's Point, and the land is owned by the Coastal Land Trust, and they inherited this structure that has portions of the decommissioned naval base on it. And you can see some rebar and pieces of concrete, pilings, some concrete pilings that were wrapped in sheet metal. And it's done a nice job of protecting the shoreline for a while, but there's portions of this that are kind of a hazard to the people that come to visit Springer's Point. And also, there's a section of the shoreline where the structure was no longer showing any kind of integrity. It was really falling apart and dispersing along the shoreline. So this is where the trailhead, if you've ever been to Springer's Point, the trailhead comes out, and they were experiencing a lot of erosion right here because it's kind of like the first time you see water when you come out of this maritime forest. And a lot of people were coming and taking their pictures and swimming right there. So the foot traffic was a concern. And in addition, you can see that in the background here, that's where that structure is still sort of integral, or it maintaining its integrity. But as you get down the shoreline, those rocks had dissipated and moved out of place. So they approached us asking what we could do in order to stabilize their shoreline in as environmentally friendly a manner as possible. And we worked to reconfigure some of the rocks where they were, and then worked with local commercial fishermen who actually bagged oyster shell for us as part of a small economic stimulus grant, and placed the oyster bags on top of the existing structure. So there was still some of that rock base and that concrete base in place, and they placed the oyster shell bags on top of it because we thought there'd be good oyster recruitment and opportunity to use these bags of oyster shell. And this is what it looked like after construction was completed. And after a year, the marsh was looking pretty good. This is where we had that big scour occurring, and we had replanted in here. The oyster bags were looking pretty good. And then we had a couple of nor'easters, a series of nor'easters during the winter. And you can see here in the foreground that a lot of these bags started to break open. So the lesson we learned was that even though these oyster bags chink together really well, kind of like Legos when when they have their integrity, when you place them on top of the loose rock, and this was also a lesson learned down in the Wilmington area. I wish we had learned it as well before doing this, but when you place those oyster bags on top of that granite or that loose rock, it's kind of like a table. It's not a Lego that is able to chink to the rock. So those oyster bags kind of slide on top of the rock, And as they slide with the wave energy, they break open, and you get shell moving across across your area, which you don't really want. And so this was an unfortunate thing. We thought that maybe if we rebagged it and had a good growing year and no storms, that maybe the bags would hold up. So we did it again. And the bags broke open again. So lesson learned. Please don't repeat our mistake. But we do have a section of the shoreline where oyster bags have done well. So we do have where there's not as much wave energy. See, this is the point. The waves and current are coming around this point. And right here, where they're sort of receiving all of that boat wake and the waves from and current from coming around the point, is where we were having those bags really move and break open. But a little bit further down the shoreline, it's quieter waters, and we were able to establish some bags of oyster shell as part of the reef structure. So this is an aerial photograph that Steve Trowell took in his flyovers, and you can see this is where the bags had broken open along the shoreline after those storms. And this is after reconfiguring it. We did remove that oyster shell from this area and replace it with granite, and then this is the section here that has the bags of oyster shell still, and this is what it looked like this past April. So it has done somewhat better. The last project I'm going to talk about is the NCAT project. You've heard a little bit about this. This is moving towards a much more structural approach to stabilizing the shoreline. This is what the shoreline looked like before. You can see this is the old Coast Guard station. It's now a teaching facility. The state spent quite a bit of money in order to upgrade and rehabilitate this structure. And so they also wanted to make sure that the property itself was protecting the structure as well. And you can see this is an old tennis court that's falling into the sound because of the erosion that they're experiencing here. This is the entrance to Silver Lake Harbor right here. The ferry traffic in and out of that channel is pretty extreme. This is looking from the cupola of the NCAT facility out towards the shoreline, and you can see they're starting to stockpile the rock. They're using barges here in order to ferry the rock out to where the sill is going to be constructed. And eventually it was built offshore. It's quite a large structure, much larger than we would typically recommend. But of course they do have 35 miles of fetch and a lot of that ferry activity coming through here. The shoreline had a lot of fill that was brought in. I can't remember exactly how many cubic yards, but it was multiple loads, if not hundreds.
About 2.5 acres.
Yeah, about 2.5 acres.
Between the rock and
Mm-hmm. And then we planted about 2 acres of the shoreline in Marsh. So we did assist them in planting the marsh grasses through some of their teaching seminars. This is what it looked like right after planting. This is about 2 years later. And this is an aerial photograph, again, sort of contrasting the before and after. But you can see how large the structure is offshore. But they have reclaimed this marsh here. It is a habitat trade-off, of course, having brought in all of that fill. But this is where those tennis courts used to be. So you can see that they've really helped to create some buffer between them and their structure and the sound. So some of the lessons that we've learned, if you're interested in doing oyster shell bags, we've learned that volunteers are great. We really love volunteers. We've also learned that using PVC tubes that are 8 inches in diameter. A lot of places are using 6-inch diameter tubes, and those work to get when you put the mesh over the bags or over the tubes. But the 8-inch diameter, if you can stretch the mesh enough to do it, it's worth it because you can fill them a lot better than the smaller 6-inch tubes. So we have Erin McCall at the Nature Conservancy to thank for that. It seems so simple, but if you're going to use volunteers, you have to make sure, or even if you're going to hire someone to do it, you need to make sure that the mesh is cut to the same length, and because you want your bags to be the same size so that you can chink them together and build your sill effectively. So making sure that someone's on quality control, making sure those bags are the same length and they're getting filled with the same amount of material is actually pretty important. We did, at our Jockey's Ridge site, try using pre-vegetated core biologs There was a fisherman down in Avon who was, as part of a sea grant proposal, was using fish emulsion as a fertilizer for growing marsh grasses. And when he was done with his experiments and using those fertilizers, he wanted to donate the logs to us to use for vegetating our shoreline, which was very generous, and we thought it was a great opportunity to experiment with them. But unfortunately, it was perhaps the amount of time that these logs had already been out in the elements. They had been out for about 2 years for these experiments, but they fell apart on us. They didn't hold together very well. So that was a lesson learned, was that those did not work in these conditions. We're learning all these lessons for you so that you don't have to repeat them. And of course, plant selection is always critical. I've given a lot of points to Ellen already, but she's going to talk next to you about picking the right plants for the right planting conditions, but really making sure that your plants are the right species and planted at the right elevations is really important. Planting technique is also something that we've kind of perfected over the years. Because we use volunteers, we have to be very specific in how we plant and give instructions for planting. So we use these dibble bars, and working in partners, it works very well. One person, especially in the lower marsh, where the sediment has a tendency to fill back in on you after you make a hole, planting with the dibble bars, having your partner sort of hold the opening for you while you push your marsh grass into that hole at the same time, and then they pull the dibble bar out while you're still pushing down. It creates a suction that helps to pull the marsh grass plug into the sediments so that it's more stabilized and held in place. Planting spacing is also something that's largely debated. How far or close should you plant? You can experiment with that yourself. The Army Corps of Engineers says 2 feet spacing works in most conditions. We found that we like to plant them a little bit closer together, anywhere from 6 to 12 inches apart. It helps to get the marsh established a little bit faster. It's a little bit more expensive to buy those plants, so if you have time on your hand, you can plant them further apart, but if you want to get the marsh established a little bit faster, I would recommend 6 to 12-inch spacing. In the upper marsh, amazingly enough, there's really no irrigation in the upper marsh, if you can believe that. So we've found that using this product called Soil Moist in the upper marsh works really well. It's a polymer that holds water at the roots of these plants. So we pre-wet this polymer, we bring it out in buckets to the site, and then the kids, it's like a gelatin. The kids love it. They put on their gloves and they reach in there and they put a handful of the Soil Moist into the bottom of the hole where we're going to plant these upper marsh species. And it just gives a little bit of a jump start to these marsh grasses, holding a little bit more moisture at their root level, because even though they're able to tolerate these drier conditions in the upper marsh, they need to have their roots well established to be able to handle those conditions. So giving them a little bit of a jump start seems to help. So I have just a couple closing slides here. If you're interested in doing a living shoreline project, but you want to know, is this going to be a good place for it? Would an oyster sill be suitable here or not? The Nature Conservancy is in the process of working on what they're calling their Coastal Resiliency app. And both Kate Murray and Christine Pickens are here today. They're in charge of this project, so if you have questions, I would direct you to them during one of the breaks. But this app is really trying to get at those questions and helping to visualize where oyster sills and living shorelines are going to be best suited. Do you guys want to say anything briefly about that?
Yeah, sure.
You need the microphone.
Sure. I'll just say it real briefly. Yeah, so that's a big question that folks want to know. Where is a good place to use some of these nature-based solutions? So we're trying to help with that part of the question. And again, this is in development, but we're getting close. But one thing I want to mention is that you're going to hear it over and over, that any kind of model that we build is a starting point. You're always going to have to go to your site and see those site conditions and make sure that the approach you're using is the right one. So just reiterating that. But we'd like to narrow it down a little bit more and help in that way. All right. Thanks, Erin.
And then another tool for you that you might want to write down, we just launched this website yesterday. So it's called the livingshorelinesacademy.org, and it has on it a series of trainings, more information, and example projects. I'm just going to take you to the site real quickly, show you some of the features. Just as we said about the Coastal Resiliency app, this is still under development, so please bear with us as we continue to add. Are we connected to the internet?
We are, but since some sort of weird presentation mode, so is your screen different from what's projected?
No,
Okay.
it's
I'm
just,
not sure if it'll show up, so click on it and see what happens.
it's thinking.
Oh, okay.
There it goes.
Let me take us out of the presentation mode and see. Is this what you want? Okay.
Perfect. So this is the website here, and you can see it says the big caveat, the website is currently under construction, but on this page we've got some general information about living shorelines. This Learn button here takes you to a series of training modules that you can work through. There's a section of training modules that's designed more for property owners that want to learn more about living shorelines, and then a second section that's really designed more for the design, construction, and permitting of living shorelines. This website is designed to be a national scope, so there's some caveats that are going to be associated with it being for North Carolina versus other states. But I invite you to explore these two training modules, and please respond, give us any feedback that you have on them. Because this is under development, we are very interested in improving this website for users such as yourselves. There's another tab here called Projects. These are some databases that we are compiling. So under the highlighted sections, because the Coastal Federation put this website together, we're featuring Coastal Federation projects right now. Eventually, this atlas will have projects from around the nation, but right now it is North Carolina focused, and because we had information on our own projects, those are the ones we loaded first. So you can click on these different buttons and they'll bring you to a smaller page about those projects. So this is the Durant's Point project down in Hatteras that we talked about. It does have the before, during, and after pictures that it shows, as well as a brief description of the project. Eventually, we will be loading the engineered designs and permitting designs onto these so you can get a sense of what the parameters were for that particular location and site. So that hopefully that'll be helpful information. And then back on the projects tab, the second section here, projects database. This is a compilation of all the other databases that currently exist for living shoreline projects. So this is where you can go if you wanted to learn about what's happening in Delaware for living shorelines, or Maryland. So this is a really comprehensive listing of all of the other databases that are currently available that we know of. If you know of others, please feel free to pass them along. And then the last section I'm going to point out to you is this Literature Resource Center. This is a compilation of the gray literature that is available. These resources have been vetted by a peer review team. Carolyn was one of the researchers that reviewed all of the literature before it got posted to this website. So it has, because it's gray literature, we wanted it to go through a more rigorous review process to make sure that it was the best information available to post on the website. So this is also a tool that is available to you, these other resources here on this website. So I invite you to explore livingshorelinesacademy.org. Please let us know if you have any feedback or information, and keep in mind that it is still under construction. And then back to the... I think that'll work. So then I just have one final slide, and this is, I saved the best for last. Is there money to do this? The local soil and water conservation districts in North Carolina are charged with administering a program called the CCAP program. It stands for Community Conservation Assistance Program, and it's run on a county-by-county basis. So I invite you to contact your local county office. Ann Daisy is here from Dare County today. She's in charge of administering this particular program in Dare County, so you can hit her up at lunch. But she does have some limited amount of funding to cost share on living shorelines in Dare County. The North Carolina Coastal Federation, we just received word yesterday that one of our grant proposals has been what's the word I'm looking for? Favorably reviewed and recommended for funding. So we don't have the money in hand right now, but starting in 2016, we expect to have a grant in place that will allow us to also cost share on living shorelines for a 3-year period, and it'll be across the state. And this grant was secured in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, so we're going to be working on living shorelines up and down the coast. And there will be an application process, and neither one of these grant opportunities is going to pay for the entire cost of a living shoreline, but it is at least an incentive. And how great are you going to be if you go to a site visit with a homeowner and say, hey, I can get you some money to do this. So hopefully these are some incentives that can be used in order to help promote more living shorelines here in the state moving forward. And with that, feel free to contact me if you ever have any questions. I'm happy to help out however I can, point you in the direction of any resources I know of, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
In your experiences, have you seen a difference between oyster culch, concrete, marl, riprap, and oyster recruitment?
That's a great question. So the question is really having to do with which material is best for building these oyster structures, and I would have to defer to the experts. So there's a lot of research going on at IMS, and I'm sure Carolyn's involved in some of it as well, looking at what is exactly the best material to use for these structures. The prevailing wisdom has always been that shell is best, using oyster shell is best, but that line of thinking may be changing with some of the new research that's coming out.
The Durant's Point sill, how high was that sill built?
It was built to about 12 inches above normal water level, and it's settled to about 10 inches above, 8 to 10 inches.
And have you seen any sediment accumulate landward of the sill?
Where it opens at the end, closer to the adjacent property owner, we have had sort of a natural spit that's formed there as sediment is moving sort of longshore and accumulating there. I haven't seen any sort of noticeable, but I'm not a surveyor, elevation change in the landward side of the sill.
So I'm curious about natural recruitment of vegetation versus planting of vegetation. And I noticed a lot of projects, there's subsequent plantings, and I'm just sort of curious about what the processes and the timelines of natural recruitment versus plantings.
Mm-hmm. Can't really speak to the natural recruitment because all of the projects that I've been involved with, we've planted. So maybe Steve or someone else would be better suited to speak to that.
You know, it all depends on your site conditions and if you got that suitable elevation. If it's too deep, you know, nothing's going to recruit there. And two, I've been involved in a project. It was one, if you remember the first overlap seal project, they actually filled it to the proper elevation and then backed off and didn't plant it. It took about 2 years for that site to fully recruit. and its widest, you know, you had natural marsh to natural marsh was maybe an 80-foot area across in width, and it sort of triangle shaped, so it necked down to about 20 feet in width, to give you an idea how big an area that was. But, you know, it recruited by rhizome and seed into the air, and it took about 2 years of 2 growing seasons for that marsh to fully cover, to get 100% coverage. But so you can speed it up by planting, but if you have a nearby seed source or an adjacent marsh where it can, because marsh spreads like St. Augustine grass or Bermuda grass, it'll send out a rhizome and then sprout off of that root. So it can recruit naturally if conditions are right.
Just to respond to that question about the natural recruitment, as long as there is, the seed recruitment is extremely low. These plants are very difficult to germinate from seed, even though they produce a lot of seed. But the vegetative spread is going to be pretty significant if you have an adjacent source. So if you have no adjacent plants within a short distance to spread over, maybe, depending on ideal conditions, could be 4 feet a year that you could spread vegetatively. But if you don't have that adjacent plant material, it would be very unlikely that you would have recruitment.
Any other questions?
When you guys are talking about fill, I know that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they dredge out all the channels, and they use that dredge spoil to rebuild islands, for example, Poplar Island and here in Pelican Island and Oregon Inlet. Is that considered fill, or is that under a different category?
I've heard it referred to a lot as beneficial use of dredge spoil material. I'm sorry, that's not a comment. I really had a thought. But as far as whether or not that's considered fill, it's applying a thin veneer in order to maintain those islands, usually in an early successional stage, so that they're more attractive to the birds that are using them for nesting sites. But I don't know if there's any Corps reps here that can speak to that better, and whether or not they're allowed to use that material elsewhere. I know there's been some questions about the Corps of Engineers needing to keep control over the materials that they dredge.
I certainly don't want to be a rep of the Corps or misspeak for them, but it's a problem. So on one hand, we've got sediment in channels we're trying to get rid of, and then we got these marshes that are starved for sediment. But you can't put fill on a marsh.
Right.
There's no permitting for that. However, amongst the beneficial uses of dredge material is this idea of thin layer disposal. And that has really kind of become a much hot topic lately. There's some big projects in New Jersey, I think in New York. In the Gulf, there have been quite a few projects where they've permitted this thin layer, and by thin layer, we're talking 3 to maybe 10 inches at most of sediment onto either an existing marsh or a low-lying area. I am trying really hard to get a project like that going on Camp Lejeune, along the ICW there, where they're always dredging around Browns Inlet. So hopefully we'll have, and when I asked the Corps about this project, they said, and I went to the Corps of Engineers, and their response to me was, well, the biggest problem is going to be the permitting. And I looked at them, and I'm like, but you do the permitting. And they're like, yeah, right. So what I gather is, we just kind of have to, if we can get one in the ground maybe, and get a framework, if you will, or a justification and some data that says, yeah, this use. But I think that potentially could be a win-win situation, managing dredge disposal as well as anchoring shorelines and preserving salt marshes.
Has anyone used Living Shoreline Project for compensatory wetland mitigation for coastal marsh impacts? Or has that been proposed by anybody?
We do not do any compensatory mitigation with our work. I know that we've talked to EEP, who does a lot of the mitigation banking for DOT, about potentially funding living shorelines as mitigation. I don't know, maybe Kathy can speak to that if it's been done or not. No, she doesn't know. Okay. Not yet, that we know of.
Any other questions for Erin? All right, well, Erin will be around